Eleanor Drake had spent years chasing secrets no one else dared touch, but nothing could have prepared her for the high-stakes crime unfolding aboard the Titanic, under the watchful eyes of its captain, Edward Smith. As the so-called unsinkable ship sailed toward the icy Atlantic, carrying ambition, greed, and danger that would vanish beneath the waves forever, Eleanor Drake never expected her quiet life in Washington, D.C., to shift the way it did in the spring of 1909. She lived alone in a narrow townhouse overlooking a busy street, spending her days sorting through case files, collecting reports, and following leads that rarely turned into anything meaningful. Most of her assignments involved small fraud schemes or routine security checks. Nothing ever reached beyond local trouble. But one rainy afternoon, something unusual arrived on her desk. An envelope with no stamp, no return address, and her name written in shaky handwriting that looked rushed, almost panicked. Inside was a single sheet of paper, carrying a warning that made no sense to her at the time. It spoke of a great ship being built and a danger hidden within it, a danger tied to men driven by ambition far larger than their sense of morality. The letter gave no names, no details, nothing she could investigate. Still, she felt a faint uneasiness reading it, as though she had accidentally stepped near the edge of a cliff without realizing it. She kept the letter in a drawer, telling herself it was only the work of an overwrought mind. Construction of grand vessels was common news, especially in a country eager to show its strength on the global stage. Eleanor often read about such projects in the papers, but she never connected any of them to the mysterious message. The warning faded into the background of her routine, becoming something she remembered only when her eyes landed on the corner of the drawer where the envelope remained tucked away. She simply assumed the sender had imagined a threat, or perhaps hoped to stir up excitement. Without evidence, she had no reason to pursue it further. Weeks passed, then months, and the world outside her office continued to move with its usual rhythm. Eleanor investigated several minor cases, none of which brought her any closer to the troubling tone of the anonymous message. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the office was quiet and the city streets dimmed, she thought about the unseen person who had gone to the trouble of delivering the letter by hand. She wondered what they were afraid of, and why they had chosen her, of all investigators, for such a warning. She could not shake the sense that the message had been meant to prevent something significant. Although she continued with her duties, a subtle awareness lingered in her mind. She noticed mentions of a single ship appearing more frequently in newspapers, described as a marvel of engineering and luxury, a vessel unlike anything the world had seen. The articles celebrated its construction with pride, focusing on its size, strength, and promise. Eleanor read them casually at first, but every new detail felt like another faint tap, reminding her of the letter she had tried to forget. The anonymous message stayed locked away, growing dust, waiting for the moment its meaning would become impossible to ignore. And somewhere far from Eleanor's quiet office, the ship it warned about was slowly taking shape, towering, gleaming, and carrying within its steel frame a story that would soon pull her out of ordinary life and drag her toward a mystery colder and deeper than the Atlantic itself. The ship that would one day be known around the world as Titanic began its rise from blueprint to steel under a sky filled with celebration and ambition. Newspapers across the United States described it as a floating palace long before its keel touched the water. Writers praised its grand staircases, its endless decks, and its unmatched safety systems. Every article shared the same idea. This vessel represented the future. Americans viewed it not just as a ship, but as proof that human progress could not be stopped. While crowds cheered the construction and investors celebrated their profits, another force moved quietly beneath the excitement, one that had nothing to do with engineering or national pride. Behind the scenes, a wealthy financier named Charles Wenton operated with a carefully polished charm that allowed him to move through boardrooms and government offices with ease. He presented himself as a visionary who who wanted to elevate America's presence in global travel. To the public, he was generous, confident, and intelligent. To those who dealt with him privately, he was known for keeping secrets locked within layers of influence. The Titanic offered him a perfect opportunity. He planned to use the maiden voyage not only to showcase his achievements, but also to transport sensitive documents tied to high-level negotiations. These papers contained financial strategies and political agreements that, if revealed, could shake powerful institutions. Wenton believed the ship's reputation for safety and luxury would protect his plans from risk. He assumed no one would expect a vessel so admired to be involved in anything beyond prestige. However, the more attention the Titanic received, the more interest it attracted from people operating outside the law. Rumors about Wenton's private dealings began circulating among underground networks. Some claimed he was smuggling rare assets. Others whispered that he had collected information worth far more than gold. Whatever the truth was, it drew the attention of criminals eager to exploit the opportunity. Workers in the shipyard often noticed unfamiliar men loitering near restricted areas, studying schedules and watching shipments. Nothing was ever stolen, and no one caused trouble, so these incidents were dismissed as ordinary curiosity. But the ones watching the construction were not there to admire engineering. They were gathering intelligence, waiting to see whether the secrets rumored to be aboard the Titanic were real. As the vessel neared completion, Wenton increased his involvement, appearing more frequently at meetings and insisting on stricter privacy around certain cargo arrangements. His behavior raised questions among those monitoring him from afar. They saw his secrecy as confirmation that something valuable would be carried on the maiden voyage. Among the interested parties was an American thief with a long history of stealing classified information. He had been following Wenton's activities quietly, tracing financial trails, listening to coded conversations, and piecing together clues. The moment the Titanic was announced as ready for service, he recognized that the opportunity he had been waiting for was approaching. While the world marveled at the ship's power and beauty, a silent game involving ambition, deception, and danger was already taking shape. And though no one knew it yet, the Titanic's destiny would reach far beyond luxury and celebration, becoming a stage for secrets powerful enough to change lives on both sides of the Atlantic. Deep inside the growing excitement surrounding the Titanic's upcoming voyage, the ship's cargo lists began to fill with crates, luggage, and shipments from wealthy passengers. Everything appeared routine, but hidden among the legitimate items was a forged loading order that blended perfectly with the official paperwork. It authorized the placement of a small, unmarked trunk into one of the deepest sections of the cargo hold. No one questioned it. Dock workers were too busy, supervisors were too distracted by deadlines, and security officers were too confident in the ship's reputation to inspect every item closely. The trunk looked ordinary, but its purpose was anything but harmless. The order had been created by Jonas Merrick, an American thief known in certain secretive circles for his ability to obtain classified information without leaving a trace. Jonas worked alone, moving from city to city across the United States, avoiding attention and using false identities to stay invisible. He preferred patience over violence, studying his targets carefully and striking only when he knew he could vanish again. When rumors began to spread about Charles Wenton carrying sensitive documents on the Titanic, Jonas saw an opportunity too valuable to ignore. The information Wenton planned to transport across the Atlantic was rumored to involve negotiations that could affect industries, banks, and political alliances. If Jonas could obtain those papers, he could sell them for a fortune or use them to secure powerful leverage. Jonas waited for the right moment to make his move. He studied the ship's loading procedures, memorized schedules, and bribed a low-level clerk who never realized he was helping commit a crime. The forged order was slipped into the official stack, unnoticed, and the trunk was accepted like any other piece of cargo. Inside the trunk were tools Jonas needed, equipment for picking locks, documents with coded notes, and a false uniform that would allow him access to restricted parts of the ship once he boarded. When he finally stepped onto the Titanic, he blended seamlessly with the flow of passengers excited about the voyage. No one suspected that among the elegantly dressed travelers and hopeful immigrants, one man carried intentions far darker than dreams of a new life or a luxurious crossing. Jonas walked the decks calmly, observing the layout, studying the crew's routines, and noting which areas remained unguarded at night. He had no interest in the ship's beauty or its grand design. He focused only on the hidden spaces where Wenton's documents might be stored. Unbeknownst to Jonas, he was not the only one watching. The criminal networks tracking Wenton had extended their reach farther than he realized. Another set of eyes followed the same clues, reached the same conclusion, and boarded the same ship with the same goal. But unlike Jonas, this second intruder had no intention of working alone. He carried alliances, grudges, and a willingness to eliminate anyone standing in his way. While passengers admired the ship and celebrated their journey, the cargo hold already contained the first piece of a silent conflict. It lay inside that unremarkable trunk waiting for the storm of greed, ambition, and danger that would soon erupt in the middle of the Atlantic. The first hints that something was amiss reached Eleanor Drake in the early days of April 1912. She had settled back into her routine after the strange letter from 3 years prior, thinking it was a distant memory. Her work had returned to the small, quiet cases she usually handled: insurance fraud, petty theft, minor embezzlement. But an urgent cable from Boston shattered the monotony. It reported that Jonas Merrick, the same man who had once been linked to a series of high-profile information thefts, had suddenly vanished. He was last seen in the city, moving with purpose, and witnesses described him as unusually tense, as though carrying a secret too dangerous to share. The authorities had no leads, and Boston officials were perplexed. There was one clue that made Eleanor's heart tighten. Records indicated that Merrick had purchased a ticket for the Titanic's maiden voyage just days before its departure. The warning in the anonymous letter suddenly felt alive once more. Eleanor's instincts told her that this was not a coincidence. She began piecing together Jonas Merrick's known activities over the previous years, cross-referencing reports of stolen documents, sightings in different cities, and unexplained transfers of money. Patterns emerged that suggested he was no ordinary criminal. He was precise, intelligent, and operating on a scale that could influence powerful figures. More importantly, he seemed to target people connected to political or financial power, making the Titanic's voyage an ideal opportunity. Eleanor realized that the same ship she had read about in passing, the one celebrated as a marvel of modern engineering, was now central to a potentially catastrophic crime. Working tirelessly, Eleanor gathered shipping manifests, staff assignments, and news articles about the Titanic's preparations. Each new detail tightened the sense of urgency. She discovered that the cargo hold included sections marked "Private, Authorized Personnel Only," areas that could hide small shipments of sensitive material. She began to suspect that Merrick intended to retrieve these hidden items and possibly sell or leak them once safely ashore. The thought of him on a vessel carrying hundreds of lives made Eleanor uneasy, particularly when she considered the possibility of unforeseen complications. The stakes were no longer abstract. Human lives were at risk. The more Eleanor investigated, the clearer it became that Merrick was not acting alone. She uncovered mentions of a network of smugglers and information brokers who had operated in the shadows for years, specializing in gaining access to restricted government or corporate data. She realized that someone on board could be working with him or against him. The potential for conflict in the confined spaces of the Titanic sent chills down her spine. A struggle between experienced criminals in such a controlled, high-profile environment could easily escalate into disaster. Eleanor began making plans to monitor the ship from afar, sending reports to contacts who could intervene if necessary. Though she understood how limited her influence would be, once the Titanic was at sea. Despite the precautions she attempted to set in motion, Eleanor felt a creeping sense of inevitability. The vessel that had symbolized human achievement now seemed poised to become a stage for dangerous, invisible forces. Every luxurious deck, every ornate cabin, and every gleaming corridor could hide secrets far more sinister than passengers realized. As the Titanic prepared to leave port, Eleanor understood that the race against time had begun. Jonas Merrick's presence was a spark in a powder keg of ambition, greed, and deception, one that could ignite in ways no one on the ship or in the offices watching from afar would ever forget. By the third day at sea, the Titanic was already a city of movement and activity. Passengers strolled along the decks, admired the endless ocean, and celebrated the promise of a smooth, luxurious voyage. Yet beneath the laughter and clinking of glasses, a silent battle was unfolding. Jonas Merrick moved carefully, following the path he had memorized before boarding. The trunk he had placed in the cargo hold contained everything he needed to access Wenton's private quarters, including carefully forged credentials and tools to bypass locks. Every step was calculated, every glance measured. He knew that one misstep could cost him not only the information he sought, but his life. Merrick had almost reached Wenton's storage area when he realized he was being watched. A shadow moved quietly behind a stack of crates. At first, he thought it might be a curious crew member or an officer conducting routine inspections. But as the figure drew closer, Merrick recognized the determined gait of someone trained, someone dangerous. It was Harlan Pierce, a smuggler who had been tracking the same information for months. Unlike Merrick, Harlan had no interest in subtlety. His goal was to take the documents for himself, no questions asked, and eliminate anyone who interfered. The collision of these two highly skilled criminals on a ship meant for leisure and luxury was a disaster waiting to happen. A silent pursuit began in the narrow corridors of the cargo hold. Merrick moved from shadow to shadow, placing small obstacles in Pierce's path to slow him down, but Harlan was relentless. He anticipated Merrick's maneuvers, bypassing obstacles with calculated efficiency. Each crate they passed, each stairwell they climbed, increased the tension. Neither could alert the crew without drawing attention to themselves. The risk of discovery was immense, but the temptation of the information kept both men pressing forward. The Titanic's massive size and labyrinthine design became both their advantage and their trap, offering hiding spaces while also limiting escape options. By the time Merrick reached the compartment where Wenton had stashed his documents, Harlan had closed the distance. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the ship echoing ominously in the confined space. Merrick worked quickly, extracting the papers and securing them in his own trunk. Harlan lunged at him, and the two collided in a brief but violent struggle. Crates toppled, sending metal and wood crashing to the floor. Neither man made a sound, but the chaos would have been enough to draw the attention of any nearby crew. The documents changed hands several times as they grappled, each trying to gain the upper hand while avoiding detection. At that moment, the Titanic continued its steady course, oblivious to the hidden conflict unfolding below decks. Passengers laughed, dined, and danced, completely unaware that their voyage had been transformed into a stage for a deadly game of greed and skill. By the time the struggle ended, Harlan had managed to snatch the documents from Merrick, slipping away into the shadows before anyone could notice. Merrick was left with nothing but the knowledge that the papers were gone, and the realization that the dangerous currents of human ambition had already begun to intersect, with the ship as journey. What started as a calculated theft had escalated into a chase that threatened to explode at any moment, a silent storm forming beneath the Titanic's gleaming surface. The night was unnervingly calm when the Titanic entered the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The stars above glittered coldly, reflected in the dark ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction. On the bridge, the crew kept watch, their eyes scanning for any sign of danger. But in one crucial section, the responsibility of monitoring a key sector of the waters fell to a single officer who had been subtly compromised. Weeks before the voyage, Harlan Pierce had made discreet contact with this crew member, offering a bribe in exchange for inattentiveness at a critical moment. The officer accepted, underestimating how much chaos such a minor betrayal could unleash. It seemed innocuous at the time, but that decision would soon set the stage for disaster. Meanwhile, below decks, Merrick and Harlan's confrontation had unsettled the hidden dynamics aboard the ship. Merrick, realizing that the papers were gone, retreated to plan another attempt, while Harlan secured the documents with obsessive care, moving through shadowed corridors and carefully avoiding areas where crew and passengers might appear. Each step was a reminder of how fragile their secrecy was. The tension aboard the Titanic was invisible to everyone else, yet it hung like a storm cloud, threatening to burst at any moment. Neither man could anticipate that the ship itself had become a variable beyond their control, a massive and unpredictable force carrying them toward a collision that no skill or cunning could fully prevent. As the hours passed, the iceberg appeared silently in the dark water, almost invisible until it was too late. The officer on watch, distracted by the bribe and the promise of secrecy, failed to sound an early warning. The massive vessel, confident in its strength and buoyancy, moved forward as though nothing could stop it. When the collision occurred, the impact was sudden and violent. Steel groaned, wood splintered, and water surged into the compartments below deck. Passengers were jolted from their sleep, and panic began to ripple through the ship. For Merrick and Harlan, the disaster added a dangerous new layer to their already perilous mission. The icy water, the chaos of passengers scrambling to lifeboats, and the structural failure of the ship itself created an environment where no plan could remain intact. Harlan struggled to protect the stolen papers, carrying them through corridors filling rapidly with frigid water. Each step became a test of endurance, each decision a matter of life or death. Merrick, determined to salvage some part of his plan, navigated the flooding decks with careful calculation, avoiding collapsing walls and panicked passengers. Every moment was measured in seconds, every choice amplified by the knowledge that a single misstep could be fatal. The Titanic, once a symbol of human pride and engineering triumph, was now an unpredictable force of nature, colliding with the ambitions and misdeeds that had silently festered aboard. The tragedy that unfolded that night was compounded by the hidden criminal struggles. In the chaos, lives were lost not just to the water, but to the collision of greed and secrecy. Officers and crew attempted to respond, unaware that the most dangerous elements aboard were not just the freezing Atlantic or the damaged ship. They were the men whose ambition had turned the voyage into a dangerous chessboard. The iceberg had struck, but the real story was not merely of ice and steel. It was the collision of human pride, deception, and ambition with a force that could not be controlled, leaving the Titanic hurtling toward its final, tragic destiny. The icy water swallowed the lower decks quickly, turning corridors into narrow rivers and stairwells into deadly traps. Harlan Pierce clutched the stolen documents tightly, his breaths ragged from the struggle, both with Merrick and with the freezing conditions. Panic had erupted among the passengers, many of whom scrambled blindly toward lifeboats that were already being lowered into the dark ocean. Amid the chaos, Harlan's careful plans unraveled. The papers that had promised wealth and power now felt like a burden heavier than the cold metal of the ship itself. Every second in the freezing corridors brought him closer to disaster, and the realization that human greed could not outmatch nature's force hit him with terrifying clarity. Jonas Merrick, shivering and soaked, followed Harlan through the wrecked halls, driven by a mixture of desperation and determination. The stolen documents were the key to everything he had been pursuing for months, and losing them meant losing not just money, but reputation and leverage in the hidden world he inhabited. He maneuvered carefully over fallen furniture and broken glass, avoiding panicked passengers who threatened to trample anyone in their path. The ship's alarms echoed through the steel corridors, accompanied by the groaning of the hull as water surged ever higher. Merrick and Harlan were no longer mere thieves. They were two predators forced to navigate a collapsing environment, each aware that a single misstep could send them into the freezing abyss below. In the middle of a narrow cargo corridor, their paths finally collided again. Harlan attempted to shield the documents from Merrick, raising his arms in a last desperate attempt to keep control. Merrick lunged, and the two men struggled violently, slipping on water-slicked floors and knocking over crates that splintered under their weight. Each movement was dangerous, and the ship itself seemed to conspire against them, tilting suddenly and sending both men crashing against the steel walls. In an instant, the documents were ripped from Harlan's grasp, flailing in the surge of water that was now rising above their knees. Both men fought, but the frigid Atlantic had begun to claim them before they even reached the deck. A final shove sent Harlan stumbling toward an open hatch leading to the lower decks. The icy water surged in, pulling him under, the stolen papers slipping from his fingers as they were sucked into the depths. Merrick, exhausted and battered, grasped at the edge of a crate, but the currents dragged him down alongside Harlan, separating them from the chaos of passengers above. The struggle that had begun in secrecy was now exposed to the raw power of the ocean. What had been a contest of skill, wit, and cunning became a fight for survival against a force neither could outsmart. In moments, both men disappeared into the frigid waters, their ambitions lost to the Atlantic alongside the priceless documents. Above decks, the passengers remained largely unaware of the silent battle that had raged beneath them. Lifeboats carried frantic survivors away from the sinking ship, none realizing that a secret crime had reached its tragic conclusion in the cargo hold. The documents, intended to provide power and influence, were gone forever, claimed by the ocean as surely as the ship itself. The struggle between Harlan and Merrick became just another hidden story among the thousands of tragedies that unfolded that night, a secret buried alongside the Titanic in the cold, merciless depths of the Atlantic. When news of the Titanic's disaster finally reached the United States, the nation was stunned. Newspapers splashed headlines across their pages, describing the scale of the tragedy in dramatic terms. A marvel of engineering swallowed by the unforgiving Atlantic, lives lost, families shattered, and an unimaginable loss of wealth. Eleanor Drake, seated in her small office in Washington, scanned the reports with a growing sense of urgency. She immediately cross-checked the passenger lists, looking for names that might connect to the criminal activities she had been tracking for years. Her heart sank when she discovered the names of Jonas Merrick and Harlan Pierce among the passengers. Both men were officially listed as having perished. There was no further explanation, only the fact that they had been aboard the doomed ship. Every shred of evidence she had hoped to gather now lay somewhere beneath the icy waters, irretrievable and silent. Eleanor meticulously pieced together what little information she could find. Shipping records, ticket purchases, and witness statements suggested that the two men had been pursuing something important, a detail that few outside her network could understand. She realized that the Titanic had been more than a ship carrying wealthy travelers. It had been the stage for a clandestine struggle, a battle over documents that could have shaken institutions and revealed secrets worth fortunes. The collision with the iceberg had transformed this silent war into a catastrophe, erasing the primary players and their evidence from existence. It was a truth that the public would never know, buried under layers of tragedy and sensational reporting. She reached out to contacts in law enforcement, providing them with the fragmented timeline she had reconstructed. All she received in return were sympathetic notes and reminders of the overwhelming difficulty in proving anything now. The evidence was lost at sea, the witnesses dead or scattered, and the stolen papers consumed by the ocean. Eleanor understood that her investigation could go no further, yet the story of the Titanic as a crime scene remained vivid in her mind. The iceberg had been the obvious disaster, But beneath it lay a human disaster of greed and ambition, silently unfolding among the passengers and crew before nature itself intervened. Eleanor documented everything she could: the disappearance of Merrick and Pierce, the rumors surrounding Charles Wenton, the suspicious cargo arrangements, and the missing documents. She included timelines, cross-references, and reports from informants who had tracked the men prior to the voyage. Every detail reinforced her belief that the Titanic's sinking had concealed more than just structural failure or human error. It had concealed the outcome of a high-stakes criminal operation that no one would ever fully reconstruct. The tragedy and the crime had become inseparable, intertwined in a story that existed in fragments and shadows. Despite the inability to secure the evidence, Eleanor felt compelled to preserve the record. She filed her notes carefully, knowing that some future investigator, or perhaps history itself, might one day recognize the hidden struggle aboard the Titanic. She understood that the public would remember the ship for its luxury, its tragedy, and its legend, but the truth of the criminal undercurrent remained her burden alone. In her mind, the Titanic had become a symbol not just of human ambition, but of its dangers, the collision of pride, greed, and secrecy with forces beyond control, leaving both lives and truth irretrievably lost to the cold Atlantic. Years passed, and Eleanor Drake grew older, her days increasingly filled with routine work in the quiet home of her office. The Titanic disaster remained a haunting memory, but for her, it was not only a tragedy of lives lost, it was a mystery that had never been solved. The files she had compiled on Jonas, Merrick, Harlan, Pierce, and Charles Wenton were carefully organized, each note and report labeled and cross-referenced. They were a testament to a hidden story, a narrative of ambition and crime that had vanished beneath the Atlantic alongside the ship. She knew the world would never hear the truth, yet she could not bring herself to destroy the evidence. The files became her secret legacy, a silent acknowledgement of the forces of human pride and greed that had collided so catastrophically on that fateful voyage. Eleanor spent her later years reflecting on the paradox of the Titanic. It had been celebrated as the pinnacle of human achievement, an object of pride and wonder. Yet it had also been a stage for greed, deception, and ultimately death. She often wondered how many other stories like it remained hidden behind the grandeur of history, how many crimes, struggles, or secret ambitions had been erased by circumstance, leaving only fragments for those willing to look. The knowledge that she alone had pieced together a fraction of that hidden truth weighed on her, but it also gave her a sense of purpose. She had been there, in a way, witnessing the collision of human ambition with forces that no planning or cleverness could control. The years did not diminish the vividness of her memory. She could recall the names of the men who had perished, the chaos of the sinking, and the invisible battles that had raged beneath the decks. In her mind, the documents stolen and lost to the ocean remained suspended in time, their secrets unrevealed, as if the Atlantic itself had claimed them for eternity. She imagined the currents carrying the papers to the depths, twisting them among wreckage and sediment, where no human hand could recover them. It was a chilling thought, but one that also underscored the fragility of human schemes when confronted with nature's indifference. Despite her meticulous records, Eleanor understood that no court would ever convene to judge the events aboard the Titanic. No one would be held accountable for the hidden struggles, the stolen documents, or the desperate chase that had ended beneath the icy water. History would remember only the disaster, the iceberg, and the heroic or tragic stories of those who had survived or perished. The criminal undertones, the ambition that had silently escalated, remained invisible, a shadow lurking behind the famous headlines. Eleanor accepted that truth as a burden and a responsibility, recording it for posterity in her private files. In the end, Eleanor Drake retired quietly, leaving the files locked away in her office. She passed away years later, having carried the secret story with her to the grave. The Titanic remained a symbol of triumph and tragedy, its legend cemented in the public imagination. Yet, beneath the layers of history, her notes and the story they told lingered as a hidden narrative, a story of ambition, greed, and human pride crashing against forces far greater than anyone aboard could control. The Atlantic had claimed more than a ship. It had claimed secrets, schemes, and a testament to how human ambition can collide with the unforgiving world in ways history might never reveal. The case remained unsolved, the truth buried in the silent depths, waiting only for imagination to keep it alive.